Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and I'm your host, Shane Phillips. Each episode, we discuss a different housing research paper, in this case, a book, to better understand how we can make our cities more affordable and equitable places to live. Our guest this week is Dr. Casey Dawkins of the University of Maryland, and my co-host is Mike Lenz. Similar to our recent episode with Michael Hankinson, our conversation with Casey focuses more on political science and political philosophy than we usually do, but I think you'll find that the theory relates to very tangible concerns here. His book, Just Housing, is all about the moral and political foundations of the housing justice movement, and it traces the history and motivations of land and housing reformers back to the founding of America and even beyond. It grapples with questions at the heart of housing justice. Questions like, is housing a human right? If it is, what does that say about our government's obligations and what we owe to each other? And how do we balance the right to private property, which, among other things, is founded on the right to exclude, with a universal right to adequate housing and secure tenure? Casey has answers. We are always thinking about how research translates into practice, so we also spend a fair amount of time on his proposal for a negative income tax and a housing allowance to every low-income household. We get into what that really means and why it might be a better approach than, or at least a good complement to, some of the more common strategies like investment in public housing or housing vouchers. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, and we receive production support from Claudia Bustamante, Olivia Arena, and Hannah Barlow. As always, you can help the show by giving us a 5-star rating and a review. And if you have any feedback or show ideas, you can email me at shanephillips@ucla.edu. Let's get to our conversation with Dr. Dawkins. Today's episode will be a little different from our typical format where we interview an author about a recent journal article, and instead we're going to be discussing a book by today's guest, Casey Dawkins. So a book, not an article. Dr. Dawkins is a professor of urban studies and planning and a research associate with the National Center for Smart Growth, both at the University of Maryland. His book is titled Just Housing: The Moral Foundations of American Housing Policy. Casey Dawkins, welcome to the UCLA Housing Voice podcast.
Hi, Shane. Thanks for having me on.
And Mike Lenz, welcome back as co-host.
Good to be here, Shane. Welcome to Casey as well. Since we last recorded this podcast, I've been to Italy, I've been to France, and I've gotten through my dose of Omicron. So it's been a little bit of dream life, a little bit of crazy life, but that's how we do it.
I haven't left my living room in 2 years, I feel like, so.
Ooh.
Yeah, you're kind of rubbing it in, Mike.
Yeah. Sorry. Well, I mean, it's not all fun and games. I've had like 5 weeks of house guests. I mean,
Yeah, how's the book going? That's the nominal reason you're away, right?
It's been really fantastic at different points, but the last few weeks, as I've been gallivanting through France and England with my friends, it's taken a bit of a hiatus.
Understandable. So, Casey, we always like to kick off the podcast with our guest telling us something special about either the city where they live or where they're from, or just a favorite place that they know well. Where do you want to tell us about, and what is something special about it?
So I've lived in the Washington, D.C. area for about 15 years now. This is where I got my accent. No, I actually grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, but I've lived here, I think, longer than I've lived anywhere else. So it is sort of interesting. I live in I tell other people I live in the D.C. area, but I've actually, I first moved to Alexandria, Virginia. Then I moved to H Street Northeast in D.C. Now I live in Tacoma Park, Maryland. So I've sort of traversed the 3 states, or the 2 states in the district that make up the region. But it's a great place to live. I mean, anyone who lives here or has spent time here would probably agree with most of what I would say. And it's people come here for the free museums, the monuments, the public spaces, but it's also a great place with rich history, diverse neighborhoods, and I'm close to the coast, close to the mountains, and the entire northeastern corridor. So it's been a great place to live, and it's being the the center of federal policy making sort of obviously has its benefits. If you like, talking politics,
Yeah, for sure.
most places will host their debate. We have debate watching parties in our bars instead of football watching parties. we have federal government shutdown specials.
All right, well, Mike, so it was your recommendation that we do this book and kind of depart from our usual approach here. And I actually did end up reading the whole book. So kudos to me. I knocked it out over the past couple weeks. But do you want to give an introduction of the book?
Yes, of course. And yeah, kudos to you, Shane. I don't say this with any negativity whatsoever, but it's not the easiest book to read. It's a lot of pleasure, but a little bit of work too. But onto the summary. In this book, which is Just Housing, I'm sure we've mentioned that already, but the title of the book is Just Housing, and in it, Professor Dawkins interrogates, a common declaration by housing advocates that housing is a human right. And so I think of that, and it's implicit in the book that at least one jumping off point or one motivation for this book is this interrogation of the idea that housing is a human right. It's an ubiquitous phrase declared by many actors in housing justice movements that seek to fulfill that promise in U.S. housing policy that housing should be treated as a human right. And this motivates Casey to trace whether American political philosophy, various social and housing movements, legislation that really establishes housing action by governments and jurisprudence, whether all of these things kind of actually support the treatment of housing as a human right. And in my reading of this argument, for advocates to be successful in using a slogan or a statement like housing is a human right, they must convince the electorate that housing is special, that there is something specific that a rights-based conception of housing should provide everyone, and that there is some kind of public entity that is responsible for providing a specified housing allotment for everybody. I find his discussion of historical movements through U.S. history very interesting and particularly important. And this also, of course, supports, how this rights-based conception of housing, I think, has evolved over time. The kind of end of the book, the latter part of the book, specifies Dawkins' preferred policies to further housing justice. And he begins with a critique of a fully public model of housing provision, which is not preferred by Casey, and he'll talk more about why. But part of it is because there's also a pretty strong defense in this book of private property rights. And so provocative argument here is that property rights both create and solve the problem of housing insecurity, which I think is really interesting and we should talk more about. His preferred way to rebalance the scales between property rights and housing rights in this country, in the United States anyway, is the negative housing tax. And this tax would be on both housing consumption and incremental growth in housing wealth. And the proceeds from this tax would go to a monthly housing allowance for those with the most extreme housing needs. And there would also be a block grant to assess spatial inequalities in housing costs. So we're going to talk a lot about the policy implications of this book. So I'll leave it at that introduction. But before we go on, Casey, is there anything you'd like to clarify in my summary or add?
No, I mean, there's really nothing I would add to clarify. I think that's a great summary. And I appreciate you sort of hitting all of the highlights. And as you sort of pointed out, I went to a lot of places in this book. I went sort of in the history of housing policy, the philosophy of justice, which was sort of really fun to return to. This is sort of even going back to my undergraduate days, but I sort of really dove deeply into that literature because I thought a lot of the arguments that are going on in political philosophy right now are really some of the same arguments that are happening in housing. And I guess the only thing I might add is not necessarily anything you missed, but maybe say a bit about my motivation for writing the book in the first place. And I started thinking about this back in it was during the Obama administration when fair housing was sort of the topic du jour and the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule was being substantially revised. And There's a big debate among fair housing advocates or housing advocates more broadly about sort of what does fair housing mean? Does fairness mean limiting discriminatory treatment in housing, or does it mean something bigger, the integration of neighborhoods by race and income? And so as I've sort of started thinking about that question, that sort of brought me into other similar debates in housing policy that were really defined by a similar disagreement over basic, fundamental goals, the justifications for those goals, and the role that housing plays in sort of tying it all together. And, the learning more about, your side of the country, you're well familiar with the YIMBY, FIMBY, debate that's going on. And, with the question of should we loosen the reins on housing supply to make housing more affordable, or should we protect tenants' rights or greatly expand the provision of public housing? I mean, that's a similar kind of debate. And so just sort of looking more at those kinds of debates which seem to be sort of pervasive in housing, I wanted to sort of, get to the core of that. And this always is usually a lecture in my housing course. What are we trying to do in housing? And usually the upshot of that lecture is, well, we're trying to do a lot of things.
Perhaps too many.
And I wanted to get to the meat of that, but really, the most interesting thing to me is we're untangling those things that conflict. We have goals that are in conflict with one another. So how do you sort of think through those things, and what's the special significance of housing, and why do we care about it, and why do we need a policy realm devoted to it? So that's sort of where I began.
Yes, I think, of course, the interesting questions are like where those tensions or those what you're trying to do kind of collides with one another. So let's start kind of with where you land, I guess, on housing as some kind of a right. So we talked about one of the motivations being whether or not housing is a human right, and ultimately you conclude that housing is a social right. So how are those two concepts different? Are those two types of rights different, and why does the distinction matter?
Sure. So to me, the primary difference is in how each right is grounded. And I spent a lot of time talking about this in Chapter 6, and I talk about the differences in sort of the grounds for human rights versus what I call, I didn't invent the term, but I'd refer to them as social rights, as many others have. And really the basic difference is that human rights are appealing to the idea of human dignity, to argue that rights are necessary to protect human beings' distinctive moral status. What is distinctive that gives us sort of normative, the status of needing rights to be protected, and what is distinctive about human beings' dignity that sort of grounds that kind of right. And that's a universal sort of ideal that applies globally. Social rights, on the other hand, protect our right to be full members of a given society and participate as equal citizens on equal terms in that society. And so basically what I want to argue is that the ground of human rights is weak without some prior appeal to what human dignity means within the context of a given society. So for example, a conception of housing justice grounded in some universal ideal of human dignity would fail to account for housing's distinctive role in distributing access to public education in nations such as the U.S., which largely finance public education from state and local taxes. Housing markets themselves are highly localized, and the conditions that make housing unaffordable in San Francisco are very different from the conditions that make housing unaffordable in London, where you're at, or Hong Kong. So, given the localized nature of housing markets and the variability in the national institutions that determine how housing gets distributed, any universal conception of the human right to housing is likely to yield a thin, watered-down conception of minimal housing entitlements that would ignore the distinctive contribution of housing to each nation's shared culture. Essentially, I feel that human rights don't go far enough to address the unique challenges in the housing realm that we face here in the U.S.
Right. So I think you've gotten to some of this, but why do you think it's necessary, or is housing special, or is housing policy special to the point where we need to ground housing policy in a rights-based framework, or do we kind of do this with everything else, or should we?
No, that's a good question. This is something that really, going back to political philosophy really shaped my thinking on this. Traditional policy analysis, sort of approach is to define your goals and define the best means to achieving those goals. And one of the things that is talked about a lot in the political philosophy literature is sort of the differences in sort of policy approaches that are grounded in collective goals versus those that are right-based. And so that was sort of really interesting to me, and I thought was really kind of crucial to this argument. And really the most important thing about any right is that it gives the right holder a kind of veto power. So it's a right to demand justification when someone tries to affect your fundamental interests, even when the majority approves of the action that's infringing on your interests. So rights essentially protect the right holder from the whims of politics in a sense, and so that's a very strong ground for a moral framework. And it's sort of interesting if you go back to history. Yeah, so the history of housing policy that I lay out is actually, I think, even more expansive than you'll find in a lot of books, because I go all the way back to the founding era, even before that.
Oh, without a doubt, yeah.
And so one of the things that I found really interesting is that if you sort of start from the founding era and go forward, there was a strong emphasis on rights-based reforms in the founding period and on through the 19th century. I mean, Thomas Paine thought that everyone had a natural right to hold property. And he proposed a tax on land inheritance to create something he called the National Fund that would provide sort of social insurance plus a stakeholder grant to everyone that would be distributed equally and unconditionally to everyone when they reached adulthood. And that sort of idea, Jefferson had sort of similar but less radical versions of that idea, had a big influence on the land reform movement and the homestead movement. But sort of an interesting thing happened in the late 19th century, when the progressive movement sort of emerged. Progressives, were sort of looking for new solutions to a variety of social ills. But at the same time, they were very critical of the idea of natural rights, and they really abandoned right-based approaches altogether. So they sort of looked for different moral frameworks to ground their policy suggestions, and so saw a lot of policies being framed in utilitarian kind of arguments. This is very common in the tenement housing reform movement, or appeals to the common good were also sort of common. But there's sort of an abandonment of the idea of the right-based approach. And, even more concerning, some of these progressive reformers also defined the common good in a very narrow way that was exclusionary, that excluded people of color or those who didn't own single-family detached homes. So you saw us sort of move away from that approach. Now, it sort of reemerged from time to time. And during the New Deal era, Catherine Bauer, who's the sort of major figure in the history of U.S. public housing reform, said a decent dwelling is not a reward withheld for the successful, but a fundamental right to which every citizen is entitled, the provision of which becomes a responsibility of government. And so Franklin D. Roosevelt proposed something called the Second Bill of Rights that would guarantee rights to, among other things, a decent home, but it was never put into law. But so my book is essentially making the case for something like the Second Bill of Rights, but for housing.
Right. So, we can talk a little bit about a couple politics-y questions maybe before we get specifically to policy. So, do you think that housing advocates should kind of rethink the housing as a human rights strategy? Because, you just talked about how rights have been used as justifications over time in different ways. Do you feel like there's something either strategically or on the merits of the question that this, rather commonly used catchphrase like housing is a human right gets wrong or is maybe strategically misplaced?
One of the primary reasons I wanted to tackle this topic is that I felt that a lot of the discussion around the right to housing was unclear. They're often calling for the protection of the right to housing, but without really defining what do you mean by the right to housing. So what does that give the right holder? What does that obligate the government to do in return? And there was really a lack of clarity around what a right to housing even meant. I mean, it's a strong rhetorical device, but what does it mean if we're going to use that as a basis for policy? And so that's what I really wanted to get at. And then sort of going back to my comments about human rights versus social rights, I think we can do better than just protecting the human right to minimal housing provision. We can deliver a right that secures the most important ingredient of a dignified American life, a home. But we need to, I think, be explicit about what that means in terms of policy. So I wanted to just really sort of make that as concrete as possible, but connect it to a grounded argument. Another thing I should probably make clear, I'm not really making a political argument. I'm not sort of offering a roadmap for advocacy. I'm making an argument from the standpoint of what justice requires, and argue that justice in the housing arena requires that more of us take on the responsibility of meeting the needs of those who are poorly housed, and essentially arguing that the property rights in housing that most of us take for granted are only justifiable if we make this egalitarian commitment. And so that's sort of the touchstone for the argument I'm trying to make. But I do think that the issue of clarity and grounding is a good thing for the movement itself, and sort of tying it to policy and moving forward.
I do feel like that, even if your book is not about the politics, obviously it's always present. And something that I think your book brings out when it talks about housing as a human right versus a social right is just this idea that housing as a human right, especially when it's not very well defined, it's very easy to interpret it as sort of a very minimal thing, as a thing that leads us to focus solely on the poorest and most vulnerable and most disenfranchised. And I think there's absolutely reason, and there's kind of a need to swing the pendulum back in a way where we are prioritizing those things. But at the same time, a frustration I've seen is just this, it almost is like that's the sole focus, and there's not really a bigger picture vision for what does housing look like for all of us, and what does that mean for the people who maybe aren't going to be eligible for subsidies or direct assistance.
Yeah, and coalitions matter, and politics do matter. Right. I mean, I guess one way to maybe think about this kind of argument is to say that any of us can be in a position at some point in our life of being between stable housing units. Those who argue for something like the basic income, for example, kind of make a similar argument. Is that there should be a minimum floor that no one should be allowed to fall below, a minimum level of assistance that society should provide to its members. And then, so I'm essentially arguing similarly that housing should be an important, sort of piece of that.
Maybe we should get into, what kind of specific benefits you think should flow from this social right. And I guess I think that follows having advocates lay out exactly what this right means and what it should confer for people.
Yeah, and I think a right to housing does two very important things. First, taking language from the human rights movement, actually, a right to housing elevates housing provision to a special place of importance in the sort of the national policy debate. Cass Sunstein, who's a lawyer who's written thousands of books, it seems, argues that rights establish a nation's constitutive commitment to protecting certain fundamental interests. Now, this doesn't mean that the right to housing can never be violated, but it does mean that when making political trade-offs, policies that infringe on someone's right to be housed will be placed under a special kind of scrutiny. And so policies, in Canada's national housing strategy is sort of framed in that way, for example. But secondly, I think a right-based approach structures the incentives of economic actors prior to exchange. So it's distinct from a traditional tax and spend redistributive approach that reallocates resources after the fact. Right-based approaches rely on what's sometimes been called pre-distribution, to assign rights, alter incentives without necessarily having to correct inequalities after the fact. So an example of this is a just cause eviction law, for example, expands tenants' rights to remain in their homes while simultaneously sort of restricting the landlord's rights to arbitrarily evict them. And so I don't sort of argue that pre-distribution is the entire solution, but I think it's an important piece of a sort of a right-based strategy.
Something you said there that I think is worth getting into a little further, and it does appear in your book, I think, a little bit as well. You said essentially that, a right to housing or any kind of right does not imply that that right can never be violated or transgressed against. And I think some people would dispute that. But can you explain a little bit further what you mean by that and kind of what the implications of that are?
Yeah, I mean, I really sort of like the political structuring argument, the best. Canada is committed to protecting the right to housing, for example. Actually, France is a very good example of a nation that tries to do this. They have a policy. I'll just go by the acronym of DALO. And I don't have my English to French guide to help me go through the acronym of what that actually stands for, but it's based on a right to housing. But essentially what it does is it gives every person a sort of a claim on public resources that should be provided to them if their housing situation renders them homeless. If you if you become homeless, there's a sort of local government agency that you can register your claim for the right to housing, and then ask that social housing be provided to meet that need. If no housing is available, then there's sort of an additional administrative step that provides you with different options, and it's administratively complex and probably not the most efficient process, but it shows how sort of restructuring housing provision around the basic idea of a right can sort of reorient the structure of the housing delivery system to ensure that at a minimum no one goes without any housing, and we sort of are distributing resources to deal with the sort of the most pressing housing problems. Canada, their version of that is to say, okay, we acknowledge the right to housing, in that in sort of the public allocation of resources, make a certain commitment to, sort of a certain dollar commitment to providing resources for homelessness alleviation and other sorts of policies. So I think it sort of changes the terms of the conversation. When we talk about now national housing policy is not being talked about as much as most of us probably wish it would be, but structuring around a right to housing sort of establishes a minimum floor of responsibility that is sort of hard to change based on the priorities that are established.
I was actually listening to another podcast just a couple of weeks ago, I think, and this discussion of rights came up, and it was, I think the argument was essentially that in the U.S. we have few rights, but they are very strongly upheld and defended when they are determined to be rights. And in many other countries, it's sort of the opposite approach, where they have many rights, but they're sort of more weakly held, and they're like serious goals and they work toward them.
Yeah.
But they don't expect that they're not gonna overturn everything to ensure that every single person has it. And I feel like that's an interesting dichotomy, and I don't know which is better, but in some ways, maybe I do. But I think that's an interesting way of looking at it.
Sort of I guess it was in the 80s, the big complaint was rights inflation. The idea that we're sort of asking for too many new rights, and we need to sort of protect the ones we have. Yeah,
and I mean, it sounds dismissive and silly, but it does take a lot to defend these rights, and it does create a lot of obligations. So there's always the question of like, well, you've established that this is a right, but can you actually do what's necessary to make that a reality?
Yeah, I think the idea is too that, as you point out, if it is indeed a right, and that's sort of a strong legal claim, then we don't want to sort of diminish the importance of what a right is by calling something a right if it's not. And so if housing is indeed a right, then let's take that seriously.
This brings up the case of New York, where they have a right to shelter. So they don't have a right to housing, but their state constitution, and this was sort of determined by a series of lawsuits, there is a right to shelter, so that every unsheltered homeless person has to be offered shelter of some kind or a hotel voucher or what have you. And it's interesting. So for one, shelter is not housing by most definitions, just to be clear, but they have a very limited unsheltered homeless population in New York, whereas here in California, it's extremely high. It's the vast majority of unhoused people. And so it sounds very good, but in New York, sort of a flip side to that is that they spend so many resources on shelter, and it leaves fewer available for kind of longer term housing solutions. And so there's the real trade-off here. I'm curious to hear, I know you included that in your book as well.
It's interesting. As I was writing this book, I started to realize pretty soon that I could have made the entire book about New York. But this idea of the right to shelter that emerged in New York after a court battle was really sort of important in establishing the national homelessness movement. And I think it's, you rightly say that it doesn't go far enough, but it goes quite a bit farther than most cities. And I think the real problem, and DC actually has something similar, and there are a couple of other examples of this in other localities. I think the real problem, though, is that here in the U.S., even the most forward-thinking laws are sort of constrained by the U.S. Constitution, which doesn't guarantee a right to housing, so it's not going to sort of protect that as an obligation, and when it conflicts with the right to own private property, it's going to side on the side of property owners. And the Supreme Court has actually said that there is no right to housing recognized by the Constitution. So, taking the right to housing seriously, I think really means fundamentally rethinking some of our basic institutions.
So you talked earlier about it being, of course, interesting when rights conflict. And, I think we talked also about when we have too many rights or many rights. I don't know if there's ever too many or whatever, but if there's many rights, like there's a higher chance that some of these rights are going to conflict. And so that, of course, brings me to property rights versus housing rights. And it also, with talking about jurisprudence around this, I'm certainly not a legal scholar, but I would strongly suggest that, any reading of legal jurisprudence in the U.S. is going to heavily favor the idea of protecting property rights over protecting housing rights, as you just basically stated. So, and bearing the lead here, you pretty vigorously defend property rights in this book. And so, I think we should talk about how those two rights conflict or they don't, and how you kind of as a scholar defend both of these rights.
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring this up. I think this is one of the most distinctive pieces of the argument, and I should say that I'm offering a qualified defense of private property. Okay. It's not a full-throated defense as a libertarian might offer. But basically, I'm arguing that the only way to justify an institution like private property that protects certain interests by excluding others is to justify that institution to those who were excluded. Yep. And the only way to do that is to provide a reasonable opportunity for everyone to acquire some property. So viewed in this way, property rights are justified to the extent that everyone's right to housing is secured. And I call a property rights regime that's sort of structured in this way a secure tenure property regime. And as I sort of thought about it, actually after writing the book, it's very similar to what John Rawls describes as a property owning democracy. And so that was an unintentional similarity, but I think it's consistent with what he has talked about in his work. Yeah, but one of the thing about the sort of that, because I think this is really important and sort of in terms of what a right to housing is, particularly within this kind of property regime. I see the right to housing as a kind of property right. So if you sort of decompose the bundle of property rights that homeowners have, you have the right to use and occupy property, the right to exclude others, and the right to exchange property for money. The right to housing, as I understand it, includes the first of these two, but not the third. Instead, under a secure tenure property regime, the right to earn income from property is attenuated and possibly limited to extend the right to housing to those who don't enjoy it. So for example, I'm not really arguing for or against rent control, but it's a good example of a policy that would attenuate landlords' rights to earn income while expanding existing renters' rights not to be forced from their homes. Now we can sort of argue about whether that in practice is what actually happens, but that is sort of an example of how something like that might work.
Right.
I want to hold on this, tenure security and tenure insecurity for a moment. I think it's something you introduce, and I feel like is a pretty core issue in your book and just to be addressed by housing justice overall. And by tenure insecurity, you're really referring to a lack of control over one's living arrangements up to and including just lacking access to housing altogether. And tied to that is a sort of neutrality between different forms of tenure, primarily renting versus owning. So how does that neutrality between owning and renting relate to tenure security? And how do we sort of bring that neutrality to fruition? Because as we all know, right now, U.S. housing policy is tilted very heavily toward homeowners and property owners.
Yeah, I mean, this is a sort of really important piece of the argument. And the idea of tenure neutrality goes back to what I see as sort of a core value in the conception of justice, which is something I refer to as civic equality. Mm-hmm. And it sort of stems from something I refer to as moral equality. And I think Ronald Dworkin has a good quote that sort of captures this idea. He says that the state should treat those whom it governs with concern, that is, as human beings who are capable of suffering and frustration, and with respect, that is, as human beings who are capable of forming and acting on intelligent conceptions of how their lives should be lived. So, sort of as Dworkin lays it out, the idea of state neutrality is sort of central to that. And this sort of goes back to Rawls. The idea that the state shouldn't justify its actions by appealing to a sort of a controversial conception of the good life that not everyone would be in agreement with. But the history of U.S. housing reform, reformers have sort of taken the opposite approach. They've appealed to the idea that homeowners are better citizens, or that the good life consists in owning a suburban home. And I'd sort of argue that housing policy should be grounded in those kinds of arguments that are subject to reasonable disagreement. But instead, housing policy should sort of guarantee tenure security across a range of housing types, sort of without favoring any particular tenure arrangement. But you can also sort of think of tenure neutrality as an egalitarian principle. It's sort of designed to eliminate tenure-based differences in secure housing arrangements by sort of elevating renters' housing security to a level closer to what homeowners enjoy.
In what ways? I've been thinking about this a lot, and how I think that security is a really important thing to emphasize here. But obviously, homeowners and renters are different, and they have sort of different interests to some degree. So, sort of how far does that extend? Trying to think of a good example here. Like, you talked about sort of attenuating the right to earn an income on your property, and I think that's pretty straightforward. But say an owner, I think this one's a little easier, but like an owner wants to move a family member into a unit that they own and evict someone who lives there. And maybe a more difficult one would be they want to, tear down a single family home or a duplex that someone is renting in and build, higher density homes. Like, how far does that right to secure tenor extend?
Yeah, I mean, you could think of a lot of sort of examples, and I think ultimately, sort of thinking back to the primary objective of ensuring that those with the least secure housing arrangements are sort of prioritized in the provision of housing policy is sort of maybe a way of thinking through those things. But it's interesting, tenure security or tenure neutrality. Sort of frame it in this. I'm sure we'll get into the negative tax idea, and that's where it sort of shows up the most. But you can also think of this in terms of a sort of a principle for zoning reform. I mean, our zoning ordinances are often sort of uplifting single family housing as a sort of an ideal housing type. And
And it needs to be protected against the intrusion of other types of housing.
And sort of relegating other housing types as inferior. And you can sort of think of a lot of examples of that. And so as a principle for zoning reform, I think this sort of idea is a pretty powerful guide.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the policy part of this, I think. So, maybe we should start with some ideas and some well-used policies in housing that are already present, in such as like public housing, right? We just talked about your defense of private property rights, which I think is part of your critique of public housing, at least, how it's practiced and why, not to spoil the fun for everybody, but why your preferred policy solution isn't just like a radical increase in the size of the public housing program in the U.S. So can you talk through your critique of public housing?
Sure thing. And I should say that the critique of public housing is not central in the book. It's sort of, I think, takes a paragraph or two. But I think it is a sort of an important argument because I don't land on the side of a large-scale social housing program. So maybe sort of clarifying why that might be the case, I think is useful.
Yes.
And it sort of goes back to the sort of, there's a chapter there in the book where I talk about sort of the injustices of homelessness or the injustices of tenure insecurity. And one of those injustices is that the homeless have no access to private spaces where they can freely engage in activities without having to first obtain the approval of someone else. They have no places in which to be free because any action requires the approval of a private property owner. And civic Republicans would call this kind of injustice domination. And Jeremy Waldron he's a legal philosopher, has written a really powerful argument around this in political philosophy as it applies to homelessness. But you sort of extend that argument. If the government provided all housing, citizens would still experience the domination of government agents rather than the domination of multiple owners of private property. What's really needed is for the homeless person to have control over their own private space, free from any form of domination, which is sort of why private property becomes an important piece of the equation. And you can also sort of, there's sort of the standard other kinds of critiques of public housing is, its markets are generally better at delivering the diversity of housing options that consumers prefer. But I don't think that's sort of central to my argument necessarily. But I don't want to make too much of that objection because I do think that some expansion of public housing beyond what we currently have in the U.S. is probably a good thing. And I wanted to sort of give an example to show how sometimes I feel like our dichotomies are too sharp around this topic in the U.S. So take Singapore, for example. As a market-based system, the government plays a significant role in the acquisition of land, the construction of housing, and the subsidies for home purchase. But at the same time, those homes are then sold to homeowners who largely retain their ownership rights. And I say largely because they have certain obligations about home appreciation. But all I'm saying is that the emphasis of policy reform in the U.S. with its large private sector role in housing provision has to be on making markets work for those who have less. And I think that's sort of the main priority that we should be focusing on.
And so like the other big policy in housing that helps people afford housing when they can't is the housing voucher program. I'm kind of skipping past the low income housing tax program, but I'm maybe kind of lumping that in with public housing in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a housing voucher program that is, in many ways larger than our public housing stock or program. You and I are friendly with a whole bunch of people that study the housing voucher program and what it can and should do. I'm even one of those people. You've been one of those people in some ways. So why not just, making the voucher program bigger and better?
So that's basically what the negative housing tax is designed to do.
Yeah.
And so it's essentially expanding the voucher program into an entitlement so that it wouldn't be sort of rationed to about 25% of households that qualify for it, as is currently the case with the voucher program. And it would also expand to include renters and owners who own incomes below a certain threshold. And so here again, sort of the idea of tenure neutrality. We're providing housing assistance that should be tenure neutral. So, and I can say more about the negative housing tax idea.
Yeah, let's get into it then. Yeah. So maybe start by talking why this is better supported by this rights framework as you understand it, and then we can get into the mechanics of it as well.
Sure thing. So, I mean, first, just sort of a real simple characterization of what it is. And the basic idea is to reform the income tax so that we tax homeowners' untaxed income in the form of imputed rental income and capital gains on home sales that are not currently taxed, and also getting rid of the mortgage interest deduction, the property tax deduction. And that'll raise substantial revenue that I can get into the dollar amounts later if you want. But essentially, the money that would be raised for that would be more than enough to provide a guaranteed housing allowance to all very low-income households. And that would be sort of an entitlement. That would be sort of the funding source for that entitlement. Anything in excess of that, the amount that would go to the housing allowance would go to a block grant program that would be targeted to high-cost housing markets. And that block grant would be used to essentially as a supply-side housing supply enhancement for places that have sort of a shortage of affordable housing supply. So, that's sort of the basic idea.
Kind of tackling things from both the supply and the demand side.
Yeah, that's really what I thought was important, because I think, one of the worries with a sort of a large-scale expansion of a demand-side subsidy is that you're just sort of replacing the problem. You're leading to inflated rents. People have more money income to spend on housing, rents are going to go up. So it's a way to sort of dampen that inflationary pressure, but also to target existing supply shortage, housing supply shortages in markets, such as the ones that you're probably very familiar with. So I wanted to sort of balance, supply side and demand side strategy. But another thing that I was sort of trying to do here is I wanted to sort of shift the burden of satisfying low-income housing needs to those who benefit from existing property arrangements. In other words, those who own current residential property and who benefit from property-based institutions have the obligation of extending rights to those who have less. And this sort of one of the sort of important features of the negative housing tax is that allocation of benefits and burdens in a proportional way that targets those housing inequalities that come out of the current tax structure.
Yeah. So I guess to reiterate, for me, I think it's very intriguing and important that we're not just taxing you're not just taxing housing transactions, but you're taxing gains in housing wealth, right? Which a lot of times those gains in housing wealth are, you're not some kind of genius because you bought, it's an accident of history, right? You bought something at a particular point in time, and maybe even like, there were public investments that occurred, or, just happenstance and luck that occurred that, led to your housing investment really paying off over the long term, right?
I think in California, the figure is something like almost like a third of all housing appreciation in the value of homes is in California. And, it's not because Californians are like smarter investors overall or something. It's just because they happen to live in California and we're not building enough housing and people want to live here. And like no individual person, no business, no landlord is responsible for that. It's a collective. It's something we all contribute to.
Right. Yeah. And then there's, you hit one nail on the head there, Shane, of course, which is like, there's, this protection of property wealth leads to some bad actors or some bad acting, right? Where you want to exclude others or, exclude additional housing or development or whatever to protect your property investment. The flip side, or an interesting outcome in that is that increases in kind of the value of your home or kind of the locational greatness of your area is going to increase your tax burden, right? And so one interesting piece of this is that homeowners kind of might incur the costs of gentrification, or neighborhood improvement or locational improvement or whatever, just as renters currently do. That's obviously a hot button topic. And that sounds great to me, even though I'm a homeowner in a place that will probably keep accelerating in value, until you inevitably get to the point where like everybody's like, I don't want anything to get better around me because, I as a homeowner, I'm going to get taxed more. The renters are going to get increasing rent pressures, et cetera. So like, is that a piece that you worry about there? And then, homeowners dominate electoral politics. So like that changes a lot of kind of incentives and acting there in some interesting ways.
There's the backlash aspect of it of even if you could make this happen, like as soon as prices start going up, do we get another, like Prop 13 where people were getting, their homes were worth way more money and they were way richer, but like that was less important to them in the moment than the fact that their tax payments every 6 months or every year were higher.
Now, I'm glad you raised this. It's a great question. That's something I actually don't talk enough about in the book. But, another way of saying the same thing is that the negative housing tax would sort of transform the housing piece of the income tax into a benefit tax. So households pay for what they're willing to get in benefits, similar to a user fee. So economists would probably like this because it closely approximates the pricing mechanism in the private market. So you sort of get what you pay for. So that's maybe another way of looking at it.
Yeah.
And there's just a lot of, for lack of a better word, overconsumption of housing that is in large part because we are not neutral with respect to tenure. And we do a lot of things to encourage people to put, frankly, more money than they should or even necessarily want to into their housing rather than other things, because you get all these tax subsidies, imputed rent is exempted from taxation. When you sell it, you get the first $250,000 or $500,000 of gains tax free. All of that encourages people to spend more, and having this consumption tax sort of offsets that at least a little bit.
Well, honestly, it also creates a huge incentive for NIMBYism. If your house is your primary source of wealth, you're going to engage in collective action to protect that. So this is sort of a testable proposition, but one might think that NIMBYism would be less of an attractive option if you're sort of losing all of your wealth gains in a form of a tax.
Right. So, race, of course, complicates any, discussion of housing in the U.S., but it also just, there's quite a lot of discussion and movement over many years on race and rights in the U.S. and race and justice, of course. You discuss racial discrimination quite a lot at various points in the book when tracing housing movements, and also in discussing the policy side of things. but the negative housing tax inevitably is race neutral. I guess so. There's two questions here, which first is like, does your concept of the social right to housing support a policy that can be used to affirmatively further racial equity, or is there kind of, can you be racially explicit in this kind of right? And then if so, how can like this negative income tax further racial equity, I guess?
And something I sort of grappled with from the beginning, as I pointed out, sort of started thinking about this book by thinking about fair housing.
Right.
And I think a couple of things I would say, and one is that this is sort of the next book. There's a sort of a chapter discussion of this, but I think this is really a sort of separate topic all of its own. But one thing I should point out there, I think that there is room for quite a bit that can be done within the framework that I set out. So one of the important dimensions of sort of civic equality is something I refer to as relational equality. And this is sort of an ideal achieved when all citizens view one another as equal participants in the social order and equally respect one another's civic freedom. And it's a sort of an expression of an anti-subordination idea that looks at the shared effects of an action on persistent group disparities. So under that guise, I think there's a strong case to be made for addressing things such as spatial inequalities that lead to opportunity hoarding, for example. A large part of that, of which is caused by NIMBYism and the desire to sort of protect your home as an investment. So although that is a sort of race neutral policy, I think it would have significant implications for sort of the spatial distribution of wealth, across regions. A couple other things I would say are that the policies themselves are race neutral, but the benefits, I think, would flow disproportionately to low-income people of color who are hit the hardest by homelessness and housing insecurity. I'm actually doing some work for HUD. I'm actually this year spending the year at HUD on sabbatical, and I'm actually looking at the impacts of some of these policies and sort of how they would play out across different household groups and spatially. And what I'm finding is that a tenure-neutral tax reform paired with this housing allowance would yield proportionately larger benefits for people of color. And specifically, it would reduce after-tax income inequality for black households more dramatically than it would for white households. So, I think there are, in sort of exploring ways in which those benefits flow more so to certain groups than others, is I think something that I want to really dive into more deeply in sort of the next phase of this work.
And getting back to fair housing again, I mean, do you see a way that this could further racial or income integration as well? I mean, is that an outcome that you think is possible in this framework?
I mean, it's a great question, and I'm actually critical of the idea in the book. I'm sort of critical of the idea of using spatially targeted vouchers to encourage low-income folks to move to high-income neighborhoods to promote integration, and sort of arguing that that's a form of paternalism. It's objectionable really for the same reason that it's objectionable to justify housing policy by appealing to the superiority of a suburban lifestyle. I don't really side on the side of sort of aggressively promoting residential integration. And this is actually something I've sort of come around to a different view on. I was, sort of early in my career, sort of a stronger proponent of sort of aggressive pro-integration policies. And I think I've sort of learned more about the objections to some of those. Folks like Ed Getz have done really great work on this, and he has an entire book sort of devoted to this topic. And I've really sort of learned a lot from him and from those conversations. And I think it's find those arguments really compelling.
Yeah, I would agree. And yeah, I found that piece of your book, it was a little surprising to me to encounter, but it was also very honest. You know, it's like in our kind of wing of housing scholarship, I certainly wouldn't say that's like taboo to say like, oh, we shouldn't encourage pro-integrative moves, but it's not usually the favored kind of solution, or it smacks some people of kind of complacency about segregation. But you know, it's hard to disagree with the paternalism inherent in it, and it's hard to disagree with some of you mentioned Ed Getz's work, which we should link to, that really I think does a great job of framing kind of the dark side of that, of adhering too strongly, I think, to that philosophy and that mechanism.
Yeah.
So for the last question here, I think I want to come back to the politics. And a couple episodes back, we had Michael Hankinson on to talk about his research and his finding that a shift from at-large elections to district elections increased minority representation. This is in California, but it decreased housing supply in the places where this shift took place. And we ended up talking about how the benefits to representation were clear and important and obviously good, but that when it came to housing, that representation mostly just created another veto point, which you kind of talked about briefly already. Really just another venue to say no, but not really any good mechanisms for saying, yes, let's do this, but let's do it differently than we have in the past. And in your book, you write, quote, American progressive reformers set out to redefine private property, and reform property-based institutions to promote the common good. In practice, most reformers pursued a conservative regulatory approach to reform, using the state's police powers to transfer particular sticks in the property rights bundle to government bodies, thereby collectivizing the right to exclude, unquote. And that line, collectivizing the right to exclude, really has stuck with me since I read it, and it echoes our conversation with Michael Hankinson. It also comes up later in your book when you talk about the tensions between the individual right to housing and a collective right to housing. So I'd really like to hear just your reflections on how we've maybe steered things in the wrong direction in terms of the institutions we've set up to deal with housing and housing justice, even when we've had the best intentions in mind. And again, that tension between individual rights to housing and collective rights to housing and what that means.
No, it's a great question. This idea of collectivizing the right to exclude was really referring to what happened when residential zoning ordinances sort of made their first appearance within American cities around the turn of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. So you think about what zoning does, it effectively took certain rights from the individual property bundle. So the right to use property in particular ways, for example, it transferred that to collective decision-making bodies. So in doing that, it gave communities the false impression that they gained a collective property right and property use. Sort of going back to the idea of a right, communities rather than individual property owners gained a veto right over the use of property, and they wielded that veto to exclude anyone who chose to use property in ways that was not approved of by the community. So that transfer has been sort of the enabling mechanism for a lot of the NIMBYism that's occurring.
Yeah.
And essentially, I'm sort of arguing that collectivizing the right to exclude sort of got things all wrong. It sort of trivialized the importance of private property to the pursuit of individual life plans, while simultaneously giving collective bodies the power to deny access to that right. And so, but one thing I want to make clear here is that I'm not making a sort of traditional libertarian argument. Although if you want to call it left libertarian, that's probably, pretty accurate. I don't think we should return to sort of the 19th century laissez-faire constitutional era. What we need to do instead is to sort of acknowledge everyone's right to that most basic stick in the property bundle, the right to use property to sort of realize your conception of the good, while possibly attenuating the right to earn income to ensure that everyone has access to housing. In terms of your comment on Michael Hankins's really interesting research, I think federalism in the U.S. has been sort of both a blessing and a curse for housing policy. On the one hand, decentralized authority has given small communities and minority groups greater representation, and it continues to do so. It's also given communities a say, even if it's only the power to say no on the issues that affect them the most. But at the same time, we haven't paired decentralized authority with a strong national commitment to ensuring that those decentralized decisions do not deprive some of access to the most basic ingredients of the good life, or a place to call home. So that's sort of what I'm hoping a right-based strategy does, is sort of reorient national priorities around that goal, and by doing so, restructuring sort of the outcomes associated with local decisions.
All right, well, I think that is a great place to end. Casey Dawkins, your book is Just Housing: The Moral Foundations of American Housing Policy. It is highly recommended by both Mike and I. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you both. Enjoyed it.
Fantastic. Thanks.
You can read more about Dr. Dawkins' research and find our show notes and a transcript of the interview at our website, lewis.ucla.edu. The UCLA Lewis Center is on Facebook and Twitter. I'm on Twitter at Shane D. Phillips. Mike is there at MC_lens. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.